Okay, good morning, Frank.
Good morning, Costa.
I have some rigmarole that I got to go through first on this. We are holding this interview at the request of the History Committee of the Health Physics Society. They're trying to get all the great professionals and in the society under tape.
I like the word great.
Yeah. And you and I have been chosen, and we're actually going to interview each other as we wrote the citation for each other for our awards. Okay. We are in Cleveland, Ohio. This is the 13th of June in the Marriott Hotel, and that takes care of the initial material. So one of the requirements of the committee is that we start from the beginning.
Okay.
So that's T equals 0.
All right.
So I'd like for you to tell me where you were born and all this sort of thing, and take yourself up to, let's say, high school.
Okay. I was born in Woburn, Massachusetts, 10 miles from Boston, and the middle of 5 children. Went to grade school and high school in Woburn. Grade school was interesting in that even at my age, within 10 miles of Boston, I spent the first 6 years of school in a one-room schoolhouse with the same teacher for 6 years. So
that's great. My two older
thank God she was a good teacher.
My two older kids did that later.
I went on to high school and distinguished myself in high school, even though I worked my way through high school. I
didn't know about high school.
Yeah.
I know about the rest. We're going to talk about the rest.
Yeah, right. And finished high school with a scholarship for the first year at Northeastern, and that started me at Northeastern, which was a cooperative program at Northeastern where I studied physics and mathematics. Northeastern
University in Boston, Massachusetts.
Correct.
Right.
Yep.
And that was one of the interesting things of the university, where they had this cooperative program. Can you tell us something about it and how you got into it and what you did during those 4 years?
Yeah, it was really very successful at that time. There was more than enough work in the Boston area to involve all of the students at Northeastern, which is a huge university in terms of number of students, in work of their choice. I mean, you'd go to school for a semester and then work for a semester. In fact, it was 10-week terms, and we'd go to school and then work for 10 weeks. And if you didn't like your assignment in 10-week, you went back and you asked for a different one the second time around, and you were able to find something that you enjoyed. I was very fortunate because I was assigned to New England Medical Center Hospital in the neurosurgery department with Bert Silverstone, the chief of neurosurgery, as my overall boss, and Charlie Robinson, his chief physicist, as my primary supervisor. And I stayed there throughout the 5 years of Northeastern.
Right. I can attest to the fact that the students were very good, because when I was at the Radioactivity Center at MIT, we always had one student on board, and had 2 always on board, but one would be at school and one would
That's
be
right.
at the center, and that meant that we had one full-time equivalent of what turned out to be very sharp kids, very good, very, very hardworking, very knowledgeable, as a matter of fact, and then we would hire more if we needed them.
Mm-hmm.
That was a great technique that the Northeastern had for helping students that needed to support themselves as well as going to school.
It also sharpened your acquisition of knowledge, because, with that interspersed experience, you really were looking to fulfill the knowledge or acquire the knowledge that you needed when you got back to work. So it worked very well.
Yeah, that's a very good point. In matter of fact, that's probably the best point of that whole system.
Yeah, it really worked.
Now, can you tell us more about what you did at Tufts? I know you said how you got started there, but I know you did quite a few things, and you were there for several years. Some of it was what you might call straight radiation protection, and some of it was what you might call medical physics.
Yeah, it really began on the medical physics side. That was started in 1952, and almost 50 years ago,
Yeah.
and that was the very beginning of nuclear medicine. And nuclear medicine at that time was nothing like nuclear medicine today. What the neurosurgeons were doing then was attempting to find a way to localize brain tumors with radioactive materials. And it was long before gamma cameras and scanners and all that sort of thing. And Silverstone's approach to it was to detect the tumors during neurosurgery, while the brain was open, while the skull was open. And what he wanted was a probe that could be used in the brain to find the tumor and localize the tumor during surgery, to guide the scalpel, if you will.
Knowing more or less where it might be to start with.
Exactly, yeah. And so he was working primarily with P32 as a tracer radionuclide, and one of my early jobs was to try to come up with detectors that would help with the localization.
This was injected just after the skull was opened?
Even before, sometimes as much as 12 to 24 hours before, depending on the compound that they were using.
Okay,
So.
now you had to develop a counter that was a pretty good counter and at the same time had to stand all the salty atmosphere of a brain.
And
electrically be
and
okay.
electrically, yeah. You were putting, something was operating at 1,500 volts into the brain.
Right.
And
Can you tell us how else?
You couldn't have an oops,
Can you tell us something about those counters?
Yeah, the counters really got very small in time and very, very precise. When I first came on board, the detector that was being used that had been developed to date was a straight wire proportional counter where the wire was stretched between the tip of the probe and back into the barrel of the probe. And the sensitive area of the probe was back 5 or 7 millimeters from the tip. And so it would not look ahead, it would only look at, so you had to penetrate through the tumor and into normal brain before you had to go well into normal brain before you could determine that you in fact had gone beyond the limits of the tumor.
Right.
And that was not healthy for the normal brain.
That's right.
And so the task that I was assigned early on was to see if I could develop a probe that would look ahead. And it was a tricky task, but I could see very well then, which was a big help. Vision. My young eyes were very useful, and working under a microscope, I was able to develop a detector with a loop at the end, and to make a stainless steel thimble tip.
A loop being the positive wire.
Being the anode,
The
right?
anode.
Yeah, and inside the probe.
Right.
And with the tip of it now being a stainless steel thimble, so that the active volume was ahead of and around the front tip of the probe. So it worked very, very well. It took a lot to develop it. We're talking about a probe that's 2 millimeters in diameter, and we're talking about an internal anode loop that's 20 thousandths across. And we had to support this, and so it was a stainless wire.
Vibrate around.
And it had to vibrate around, and it was a stainless wire with blown glass insulation around it, guiding it down the stainless probe. And of course, all of this had to be evacuated and gas filled with the proper counting gas, and had to withstand the 1,200 volts that we typically operated at. So it was a wonderful physics exercise, if you will, and that's what research physicists like to play with. And as I said, I had the tremendous advantage of being able to do this as a teenager, literally. I mean, in my first, second year, or third year of college, So it was
Have you
tremendous.
got an example of something like this?
Yeah, I brought one of the latest versions with me, and I don't know whether you can see this thing where it's so small, but is there a way to get a look at the probe itself?
Does that show up better? There you are. The probe is pointing up.
Yeah, the probe is pointing up. The sensitive tip is out here at the very end. There's a BNC connector at the back end. This is one of the last ones I built, which was probably in the mid-60s.
And what you pulled off was the protective case.
What I pulled off is both the protective case, and if you look at the end of this, hold that up again,
Yeah,
Costa.
okay.
But if you look
Yeah.
at the end of this, there's a hex piece at the very end. That hex piece goes on over a curled piece of uranium foil. And so when you put this on the end, it is your test source to be sure your probe is working. It's both protecting the probe and providing you with the test source to be sure the probe is working. And when you take it off, then your background, of course, is zero with this very small counting volume. And we can go from there.
Very good.
But these were used in surgery by many centers at the time. It was later replaced by external localization as the scanners and cameras got better. And Silverstone continued to use these. He found it very useful to use during surgery, at the end of surgery, because you could go in and be sure you hadn't missed anything. You could just be sure that there was no
residual material.
There was no residual tumor left there.
Search for the radioactivity, and
that's right.
meant that there was tissue.
That's right. So he continued to use these as long as he was operating neurosurgically. So
you mentioned in the beginning that nuclear medicine is not like it used to be. In fact, we were working in those days at the beginning of a golden age of the use of radioactivity that has now come on down to what you see, and nobody really knows what the beginnings were truly like.
The early days of external localization for tumors in the brain, again, I'm still working in neurosurgery, we actually had photomultiplier scintillation counters suspended in lead shields from chain falls, and we would seat patients under the chain falls and hold the probe up against their head and take a count at this position, then move it to another position and take another count. and over a period of a half a day, get some reasonable localization of where the tumor was most likely to be, just by statistical analysis of the count rates in different positions.
Which you can do in no time now.
That's right, which is now all done automatically. But that was really the beginning of nuclear medicine. At the same time, I was doing some health physics work on the side.
That's what I want to get to now.
Right.
What was involved in that? Because that was really your beginning of your career in radiation protection.
That's right. And I had to make some hard choices later on as to which direction I wanted to go. But I was assigned, at that time, the way the licensing was done, it was very peculiar. It was under the Atomic Energy Commission. And the licensing in the early 50s, each department that was using radioactive material in the hospital had their own license.
That's correct.
And so I was assigned to do independent survey work in endocrinology and hematology and just to be sure that they were handling their radioactive materials properly, and everybody was doing their own thing, and there was no merger of these programs. So I did that through my college years, and then when I graduated in 1956 with a Bachelor of Science in Physics, they wanted me to stay on full-time. I was actually working full-time by then. I was working evenings while I was going to school and during my co-op assignments.
A real driver from the beginning, huh?
Well, but by necessity. I was married with 2 kids by the time I graduated from college. So there were reasons. But they asked me to come on full time, which I was happy to do. I liked what I was doing, and then I was named the first radiation safety officer that New England Medical Center had. Mm-hmm. And the following year, 1957, we got the first broad medical license in the Boston area from the AEC. They were just beginning to talk about, Part 20 had developed at that point to the time when they were talking about broad licenses. And so in 1957, we got the first broad license in the Boston area that merged the programs from all of these departments and eliminated the individual departmental licenses. And I was the named radiation safety officer at that time.
Did these departments respond to that
Yes.
reasonably well?
Yeah, for the most part, they were happy to have the responsibility for the administration and that sort of thing fall under somebody else's hands. Yeah, yeah. And there was a little adjustment, but it was relatively easy because they were used to me and I was used to them. I had been doing it with them under their licenses up until that time, and so it was something that was welcomed. But it was an interesting change. And it really began to steer my path as to where I would go.
And you made that choice
Yes.
in the long run, which is happy for the health physics profession, but I'll bet you would have done just as well as a medical physicist.
Well, I've kept my foot on both sides of the aisle all along,
We can talk about that a little bit later on. Is there anything else that was special at Tufts that you might want to mention? You became a real health physicist at that point, and not only were responsible, but you grew and you had a small department, as if I remember correctly.
That's correct, yeah.
So you had a real operation in a medical environment.
That's correct, yeah. And those were unusual times because there was very little guidance. The regulators were sort of feeling their way along themselves. There was very little guidance as to how you run a program, so you were pretty much on your own with respect to how you ran a program and how you established a program. It was a good time. It was an interesting time.
Actually, unofficially, we were contributing to the production of the
regulations.
Regulations.
Exactly. Yeah. It's much more prescriptive today than it was then. Whether that's right.
We did just as well, if not better, as far as I'm concerned.
I think so. I think we were able to be innovative and original, and we could buy into our programs in a much stronger way.
Right.
So.
Okay, now there's a transfer to another organization coming up.
Yes.
And can you tell us how that came about? And we want to hear some more things about what you did there.
Yeah, in the late 50s, 59, an opening was created at MIT. They wanted to expand the program at MIT. MIT really only had one health physicist at that stage in the game, Sam Levin. And Harriet Hardy, who had set up the entire program, Environmental Medical Service at MIT.
That was called the Occupational Medical Service.
It was called the Occupational at the time, that's right.
And she was brought in specifically to do this sort of thing.
That's right, and that's where you and I met, because you were there. Yeah. You were there at the reactor. And anyway, Harriet recruited me to join the campus radiation safety program at that time, and I did, which was a complete commitment to full-time health physics at that stage in the game. And I did it with negotiated understanding with Harriet right up front that I would stay on at New England Medical Center at least for a period of time. They had asked me to stay on one day.
Who's the they?
New England Medical Center had asked me to stay on for one day a week until they found a replacement. And I agreed to try to negotiate that, and Harriet agreed because she felt that my continuing exposure in the medical area would be overall useful to the MIT program. That was 42 years ago, and they haven't found a replacement yet. I'm still doing that. So,
one of these days they will. They'll have to.
I'm still the RSO at New England Medical Center, and I'm the only RSO they've ever had.
And Harriet was willing to live with this arrangement.
Oh, she thought that it was very healthy. She really not only allowed it but encouraged it. So
right. Now, what sort of your curriculum vitae is endless, I might say. So we want to home in on a few things, but you have to help in the homing in.
Sure.
At MIT, as the radiation protection officer, and eventually you became the head of the whole thing, as we know now.
Yep.
What sort of things were that would be highlights, 2 or 3 or 4 that would be of interest to people and that were important to you in the progress of your occupation?
When I first came in, it was an expansion of an existing program. There were some issues that needed to be addressed. I was assigned initially to pull together in a more formal way the radiation protection program for the particle accelerators that were on campus. There were 30 operating particle accelerators on the MIT campus when I arrived there in 1959. Bob Van de Graaff was still on the faculty.
That's right.
And there were Van de Graaffs everywhere you looked. And in fact, I was right back into medical physics because there were 3 Van de Graaffs that were being used for patient treatment for the hospitals in the Boston area. That was the very beginning of accelerator external beam therapy.
Right.
And the hospitals...
Electron and photon.
And photon, and the hospitals couldn't run these machines, and it needed Bob's kindly touch to keep those machines running.
Right.
And so they were run at MIT for the hospitals. The prescription for the treatment was made by the doctors at the hospitals, and the hospital sent nurses and doctors over to actually man the program. The machines were run by MIT people. And so I got very much involved in overseeing that program from both a medical physics and a health physics point of view, setting up and making sure that they followed good quality management techniques to be sure that the beams were doing what they thought they should be doing and the energies were where they should be and that sort of thing. And that was probably my first year was spent on trying to get a reasonable program going with all of those particle accelerators, and it was a decent challenge and a good start for me. Shortly after that, I was assigned the task of decommissioning the Hood building.
Oh yeah, right. I forgot about that one.
That was a year-long task.
You wanted to tell us what the Hood building is.
The Hood building was the building in which nuclear metals worked during World War II. It was a Manhattan Project building. Where they were doing research with the separations of uranium and also working with extensive quantities of beryllium. And the building had been abandoned the year before. It had been abandoned in 1958. Nuclear metals had been split off into a separate company, and MIT did that. They had internal departments that would Draper Laboratory, the instrumentation laboratory, the old instrumentation laboratory is another example. Once they developed to the point where it was better handled as a commercial entity than a division of a university, they spun it off and let it go as a separate corporation.
Several different groups.
They've done that. MITRE Corporation is probably one of the most famous.
Right.
MITRE is MIT Research Electronics.
Yeah, right.
That's what it stood for originally, but it's now a long private
Now nobody knows it. Now it's
institute.
just an acronym.
That's right. But they did that with nuclear metals in 1954, and from 1954 to 1958, they continued to operate in the Hood building and at 224 Albany Street, down past the reactor. But they were operating as a private corporation, renting space from MIT during that period of time. When they moved out in 1958, they moved their hardware out, but they left the ductwork, for example, and the cyclone collectors and that sort of thing in the building and on the roof. And
material between the cracks of the wooden
and the wooden floors. The Hood building was Hood Milk originally. Yeah. It was a century-old building that had been built for Hood Milk, and it was a milk processing, a dairy processing facility, and it was not designed or built for nuclear metals type of work at all, and so decommissioning it was an absolute nightmare.
But during World War II, it wasn't much choices to what you were going to choose.
No, you used what you had, and
absolutely.
You did what you could. But it was a startling experience in many respects. The ductwork that was running through the 4 floors of that building would be, 8 feet in diameter, just huge ductwork overhead that was servicing all of the machinery that they were using for machining and processing both uranium and beryllium. And when we opened up the ductwork to remove the ductwork, we found that the opening in the middle of these 6 to 8 foot diameter ducts was up like this big. That the coatings on the walls were literally feet thick.
That's amazing.
Yeah. And
what do you do? Just look at it and say, what do I do?
Well, we had to handle it with kid gloves, but the thing that occurred to me is that we were making the wrong measurement. And because we were making gamma ray measurements from the outside of the ducts.
And nobody had done any decommissioning of this.
Not of that sort at all. So I went and got neutron detectors, old BF3 detectors, which is all we had at that time for neutron detection. Mm-hmm. We could actually measure the neutrons coming off the ducts from the combination of uranium and beryllium in the ducts. So we had to handle this with kid gloves, and we took down section by section of duct, capped it and sealed it. And we had a railroad spur running right beside the building, and we just lowered that stuff onto flatbeds and on the railroad. And it went up to West Valley and was buried in the West Valley low-level waste facility. And that's where it is to this day. But once we got the ductwork and the cyclone collectors out of there, then the bulk of the activity was gone. And then we had to truly decommission the building. And as you mentioned before, the wooden floors, they were double thick, tongue and groove, yellow pine, 2.5-inch thick wooden floors, all doubled. And the planks would run one way at one level, and then underneath they'd be running the other way, the other level. So they were 5 inches thick, yellow pine wooden floors. We had to take the first layer of floor out, and it had to be treated as all radioactive and go to West Valley and be buried. But we were able to get the building down to where we could bring a regular commercial wrecker in to take the building down brick by brick. They wanted to take it down brick by brick because they wanted to save all of the building materials. And it was easier for them to work that way and for us to examine everything that they took out and clear. We cleared 95% of the building after we did the initial decon.
I think we should have pointed out that this building was at the corner of public streets with pedestrians going by,
Massachusetts
traffic
Avenue,
going by, and everything else. And this was done under those conditions without an event.
That's right. Yeah,
that's remarkable.
We got it. We got it through. And the other building, the Air Force building down at 224 Albany Street, we decommissioned that from the inside out, and the building is still standing.
Yeah. Right.
And we were able to clear it out to a complete release. This was funded by the Atomic Energy Commission. That all of that decommissioning was funded by the Atomic Energy Commission out of the New York Operations Office, and they sent somebody up at least once a month to review what we were doing. Mm-hmm. And so they had no better idea on how to decommission this than we did at that stage in the game.
But the important thing was that you took time to think about how you did everything rather than just saying we're going to decommission and just go ahead. I mean, and planning was one of the most important things.
It really was.
As much different ideas as you could to balance them against each other.
Well, a lot of the preliminary work had been done before I came on board. So it started in 1958 when Nuclear Metals left MIT, and I didn't come on until the middle of '59. And a lot of the preliminary work had been done, and most importantly, the permissible residual alpha contamination level had been established by the AEC at that time. And I started making surveys. As soon as we got the ductwork out of there and so forth, I started making surveys, and I discovered that even in the office areas, we couldn't meet the restrictions, the limits that had been set. Then I went back to other buildings on campus, and I started doing alpha surveys in areas that had never seen alpha activity. And I discovered that the gold was cleaner than clean, that the gold was cleaner than the natural levels. And so that was the first thing we had to do, was go back and revisit the levels that had been established as absolute limits. And we got that relaxed, and then we could get somewhere.
Right. You also, at the basis of your accelerator work, you got involved with a slightly larger accelerator.
Yeah, in the late 60s.
In which a number of ingenious things were done.
In the late 60s, MIT got funding from DOE to build the Bates Laboratory, which is at that time was going to be a 400 MeV electron linear accelerator. There was a lot of study given as to where the machine would go. Originally, they talked about putting it right under Briggs Field on the Cambridge campus. They gave that up because Briggs Field is only about, the surface of Briggs Field is only about 3 feet above the surface of the Charles River. And if we had excavated to put the accelerator in there, we would have been pumping the Charles River throughout, to date.
Eternity.
We would have been pumping the Charles River, because that was all fill land from the old Charles River mudflats. And so the eventual decision was to build it up in Middleton, 20 miles north of MIT. And they got county land given to them by the Essex County for the construction of the facility. And
this is how many miles from Cambridge?
20 miles.
20
It's
miles.
20 miles from Cambridge. And I did a lot of the preliminary groundwork for the site. I served on the committees that made the decision on where to put the machine, and I did a lot of work on the beginnings of the establishment of the program up there. But Harriet was reluctant to give me the assignment up there because she really wanted me on campus. And so we went through a couple of searches for an accelerator radiation protection officer for this program, because it was clear that it would have to have its own, just as the reactor did with you at the reactor, it was clear that it would have to have its own health physics team. And after 2 tries, I think it was 70 or 71, that Peter Demas, the initial director of the laboratory, the laboratory was then under construction. They were building the accelerator. And this was an MIT-designed accelerator. They designed the waveguides. They designed the entire facility. And it was under construction at the time. And Peter came to Harriet and said, "Can't we please have Frank up there?" And so, and so the decision was made that I would leave Cambridge and become full-time out at Middleton, but still with committee responsibilities and that sort of thing in Cambridge, and you know, I would go back and forth and spend maybe a half a day or a day a week in Cambridge, but my prime responsibility would be the Middleton program. And so that was arranged, and I spent 10 years then primarily in Middleton with the early development of that machine, and it was a really wonderful challenge in every respect, because we were bootstrapping from the ground up. That machine,
but it was a high current machine.
It was a very high current
and that's
machines.
an important thing people to know and understand.
We could put 200 kilowatts of electrons on the dump. I mean, that was a blowtorch. That is a blowtorch of a machine, and it really, when we first, just as a sideline, when we first turned that machine on, the town of Middleton, the little town of Middleton, had an ironclad arrangement with the power company that any electric power that was used in Middleton came through their lines, and they got their piece of the action. You could not bypass the town of Middleton. They were a licensed distributor of electric power for anything that went on in the town of Middleton. And so the LINAC was actually run off of the Middleton lines for a year. And the transformers and so forth at Bates just had, I mean, we were using 85% of the electric current in the town of Middleton.
Could handle.
Right, yeah, so we were 4 or 5 times the rest of the town. And when we would short out a transformer, then fuses didn't break. I mean, we had to break a bus, and until we got a chance to get somebody in to safely do that, the voltage in the town of Middleton would drop to 50 volts. and then the townspeople started screaming. I mean, they were losing television sets and refrigerators and everything else. And so then they finally decided we needed our own high line, and so we got a high line in directly from the Salem station, and things got better then. But the machine was developed in very short order and came online. First beam was in 1971, and there were many challenges associated with the health physics with a machine development like that, because first beam was in a 1,000-foot long tunnel, the first 200 feet of which had accelerator in it, and the rest of it still under development. And so we had to build a shield wall in the middle of the tunnel and put a dump in at the front end of the tunnel to protect the people who were still working down tunnel while the machine was running up in the front end, nothing of which had been
during the test period.
During the test period, nothing of which had been. We developed it and operated it first at 100 MeV, and then eventually up to 400 MeV, and then 5 years later, in the mid-70s, they doubled the energy of the machine by putting in a recirculator. They extracted the beam after accelerating to 400 MeV and turned the beam back and drifted it back to the beginning and re-injected and gave it another push to 800 MeV. And then they later added another RF transmitter and boosted everything to 1,000, so it is now a 1G EV machine. Still at the same current. Still at these very high currents.
Yeah,
that's right.
Exactly.
Most of our dumps go underground. We're on a drumlin,
right.
And good old New England drumlin, and so we can dump most of the beams into the hill. But one of our beams comes out at ground level, and we have 4 feet of iron and 24 feet of concrete behind the dump. There's a dump first to take out most of the beam.
Sure.
Then there's a 4-foot iron shield and 24 feet of concrete, and you can go into the backyard with a GM survey meter and find the beam.
Still find it.
And still find the beam coming through all of that shielding. So.
Okay, let's switch now, and we have to do this in short order because your things you've done for the Health Physics Society are endless, starting from the very beginning, helping found the society, all the way to being president and past president and getting involved with the Council of Scientific Presidents,
yep.
and so forth. So pick up a couple of things that might be of interest during that whole career.
My first experience
involving IRPA as well.
Sure. Yeah, my first experience with the Health Physics Society was in 1960. You'll remember that.
Yeah.
The 1960 meeting of the society was in Boston, and there was no New England chapter at that time. That was my first year at MIT.
The only thing that was around at that time was what was called the Boston Medical Physics Group.
That's right.
And that
That's right.
had some radiation protection aspects.
That's right. Yeah, and that
And
really
that was
became a division of AAPM.
American
yeah.
Association of Physicists in Medicine even.
No, that's right. That became.
These were the starting. This Boston group was the start.
That's exactly right. And so there were a few of us that could make a core to work with that initial meeting in Boston. And the interesting thing about this is that the Health Physics Society annual meetings were not necessarily held in areas where there was a chapter or anything like that at that stage in the game. And so anyway, they came to Boston. The president of the society at that time was Elda Anderson, and that's where I met Elda Anderson. And so I was very active in that Boston meeting. I joined the society in 1959, the Health Physics Society in 1959 when I first went to MIT. And I joined AAPM at the same time. I'm a charter member of AAPM. And so,
that's correct.
And so that was the beginning of my experience with the Health Physics Society. As a result of that Boston meeting, we developed the New England chapter. And I served as the chairman of the of the Charter Committee.
Charter Committee, right.
For the New England chapter. And I served as New England chapter president, I think 64, no, 64, right at the third or fourth president.
Yeah, right.
And Russ Cowling
was
one of the first presidents,
yeah.
okay. And so I worked with Russ and the early presidents of the state. Moeller was one of the very early presidents. He was at Winchester Lab at that time.
Sure.
Yeah. So it's I worked with those people.
Well, you had a good knack of running things.
Yes.
I have to give you full credit for that over the years that I've known you.
I am a man.
And you really took that to the highest levels of being able to participate well and run the show well and everything else. And most of the time being right. This is what's really amazing.
And if I wasn't right, I was able to convince people I was right. I was very busy. I was very busy for the chapter. I did a lot for the chapter in the 60s and the 70s, right. and we built the chapter up in great ways. And it wasn't until the late 70s that we pushed hard to bring another meeting to Boston, and I chaired the effort to bring the 1980 midyear to New England, and I chaired that effort, and that really got me busily involved at the national level, and that really got things started for me. I was appointed to the Symposia Committee and served as chair of the Symposia Committee, and then I ran for the board of directors.
Weren't you on the venue committee at one time?
No, not the venue committee per se, but the Symposia Committee actually did its own venue at that. There was no separate venue committee then.
Right.
Yeah. And so I began to get involved, and I was elected to the board of directors, and then I served that 10-year stint where I was on the board of directors and then treasurer, and then I actually ran for president as I finished my first stint on the board of directors, and I ran against my good friend Dave Waite, and Dave knocked me off, and it's probably the best thing that ever happened, because the reason I ran for the presidency at that time, I was finishing my 3-year term on the board, and I wanted to continue as an officer, but the officer seat that was open, the lower officer seat that was open at that time was the secretary instead of the treasurer.
Yeah.
And I knew I never wanted to be secretary, okay? And so my choice at that time to continue right on directly was to go for the presidency. And so I threw my hat in the ring for the presidency. And as I said, Dave knocked me off. But that put me off for a year then, and that opened up the treasurer's slot. And so I took on the treasurer's slot the following year. And so I actually never missed a meeting because...
and then worked your way up the ladder.
And then I went from treasurer to president. And that was really the order that I wanted to do it in, and that's the way it went.
I know when I was treasurer, when I was on the board and I was on the finance committee, I think I was chairman of it.
Yeah.
I didn't like the way the decisions of the finance committee were affecting what the president wanted for his program.
Yeah.
And that was the beginning of the change. I arranged for Bill Baer to make the change. You came on board and then affected the change and affected it very well.
Yeah, the treasurer's program and the finance committee, I think, work very, very well now. It's a very, very well-structured organization, and it really runs the society like a business, and that's my forte. I'm a businessman and I'm a manager, and I had a lot of fun doing that. We actually established a goal for the society's funding, and we established a goal of how much money should be in the society's treasury and a way in which to make that happen. And we saw a 5-year term necessary to get the funds up to accomplish this, right? That's when we set a fixed income for the society for every annual meeting that was run and those kinds of things.
That's what I meant by when you established the whole policy of doing this correctly based partly on your background of
My
knowing
bu-
how to handle
my
money,
business background, that's right.
which was great.
So that we actually met our goal before I finished as treasurer.
Yeah.
We met our goal in 2 years instead of 5.
Right, that's
So
correct.
and so we saw a substantial income over those 2 years with good management, and it worked out well.
We're nearing the end. Are there any external committees not having to do with the Health Physics Society or maybe related to radiation protection that come to mind that are of interest and important to you? I know you're part of IRPA, for example.
Yeah.
But you've done a lot of other things.
Well, let me go back
You've done
because
some work
since
for the National
1960,
Academy
well,
and-
since 1964, I've been the director of a local bank, okay,
Yeah.
a $100 million bank, and I am now the chairman of the board of that bank.
I was
And
going to
so-
wait for the end for that, but
So
go ahead.
no, but I mean that's been a root for my business background. That
Sure,
really
I
has
know,
helped
I
a lot with
understand that,
my
exactly.
business background. And it's when you're handling somebody else's $100 million on a routine basis, it gives you some experience that is useful
To say the least.
for all of these things. And while I was president, you automatically serve on the Council of Scientific Society Presidents.
Yeah.
The Health Physics Society is one of those societies, and this is a group of 60 societies, and you put the presidents of 60 societies in a room, and it's like herding cats. I mean, in every sense of the word. and I managed to stand out in that
Do well there as
stand
well.
out in that group to the point where I became the president of it. And not only was that the first time the Health Physics Society had anybody in any kind of a responsible position in that group, but I still am the president who represented the smallest society that has ever been in the chair of that organization. Because it's usually the American Physical Society
right.
and the American Chemical Society, or one of the huge societies
thousands of members.
that dominates that program. So so it was an interesting responsibility. It was a lot of fun doing it,
And there was a lot of interaction with Congress and everything
Yes,
else, and
yeah,
that was the
yeah.
start of our getting involved with
Yes,
Congress,
yeah,
if I remember correctly.
Yes, it was, and I really tried to parlay that connection. Vern Ehlers I got to know very well, the only physicist in Congress at that time, and the society is now using him very heavily as their contact on the Hill, and he's a great guy. He is a former professor of physics from Michigan. So,
Yeah, right.
So he's a great guy and somebody that really understands what we're about and what we want to do. And so that's the approach that has to be used, I think, and that's the approach that Keith Dinger is using very effectively now. And so that has worked very well. And that's, I think we used CSSP in the very best way we could at that time, and hopefully we'll continue.
Can you do
to use it.
anything through CSSP still, or is it?
Oh yeah, no,
it's
we're
up to us, the society, to do it
it's up
directly.
to whoever the president is to make the inroads
Right.
and to use that avenue.
Yeah, that's right. The president continues.
That's right. It's the current president. I mean, once you're past your past presidency, you are no longer a member of CSSP. I'm
Right.
invited all the time to come to the meetings
Yeah.
as a past chairman, past president of CSSP. But it's you're there as an observer and not as a participant. It's not the same. And so it's but it's an interesting avenue that the society needs to continue to take advantage of. In 1992, when I was president, I led the delegation to the IRPA Congress in Montreal, and I was elected to the executive committee of IRPA at that time. And I've been active. I served my 8-year term, which ended in Hiroshima, as a member of the executive committee. And the executive committee asked if I would stay on as treasurer at that time. And so now, part of the reason for that is that while Charlie was president of IRPA and I was sitting on the executive committee, we were negotiating. Charlie Meinhold, yes.
Meinhold.
We were negotiating with the arranged World Congress in Vienna. And we were sitting around the table at the executive committee meeting at Portsmouth in 1994. And Charlie turned to me and he said, "Frank, how are we going to fix the treasury of IRPA?"
Turn to the right man.
And so we did, right then and there. We imposed on the Vienna venue, midway through their preparations, we imposed upon them a requirement that they turn $30,000 into IRPA as profits from that meeting, as a return for running the meeting in Vienna. And they did it, and they did it well. They did it handsomely. But that now is in the rules of IRPA.
Right.
And that now is a fixed income for IRPA. That's right. And I sat down with the Treasury people from Vienna and showed them how to do it, and went through their budget with them, and we turned the budgeting in IRPA around at that time to make it work. And so at the end of my 8 years on the IRPA executive, they turned to me and asked me if I would take on the treasurer's slot, which is an indefinite. This is the first time the treasury of IRPA has been outside of Switzerland.
Is that right?
in the history of IRPA. I am the first non-Swiss treasurer.
Did you pull all the money out of Switzerland?
The money is in Cambridge, is in my bank in Cambridge. Where I can really,
in a separate account.
Oh, absolutely. Where I can really watch it and be sure it's working.
Well, we're getting near the end, so let's close off with one more item. You do have some other business activities where you founded a couple of companies.
Yes.
Can you tell us something about that?
The first company.
Show that you don't do twiddle your thumbs in the evening.
In the 60s, we had the advantage of working with Bob Evans. Okay, Evans was still running the Radioactivity Center at MIT. The Radiation Protection Program, that was when I was still on campus. The Radiation Protection Program at MIT depended on the iron room for whole body counting for people at the cyclotron and at the reactor. The cyclotron was still operating in the 60s, and people were getting internal depositions from their exposure to both of those. At that time, the work that was being done by Charles Coriel, for example, was they were filling out
the radiochemist.
The radiochemist was filling out the Segre chart with the tail end stuff, both at the cyclotron and the reactor, with the radionuclides that were on the nuclear data that there were 2 and 3 second half-lives, okay, that sort of thing. And so they were irradiating large quantities of fissionable material and doing quick chemical separations with those materials and quick analysis on it. And they were handling with enough activity so that they were likely to get some internal depositions of fission products, that sort of thing. Bob was worried about the contamination of the iron room with all of these people that we were tramping through the iron room. And so we developed the chair counter, the Masse chair counter that actually became a standard for the French Atomic Energy Commission. And all 80 plants in France had our chair in it at one stage in the game. And we had the advantage. I mean, we developed this thing as a shadow shield, go-no-go sort of screening detector. And but we had the advantage of being able to, anytime we saw positive results, of being able to cross-calibrate with Evans. And so we discovered that this thing is really more than a screening device, that it could be set up in such a way to be an absolute counter.
Right.
And so we developed it as an absolute counter, and we even showed that it was good for not just the gamma emitters, but for the beta emitters, the pure beta emitters.
Right.
And we had a nice relationship going. You can imagine the way Bob enjoyed doing this. He would, if you remember the radium dial painters that he was measuring all the time, when they discovered the problem with radium, then a lot of the companies switched to strontium-90, which was a tremendous advantage, right?
Sure.
They weren't getting radium in them, they were getting strontium-90 in them, the dial painters. So he had strontium-90 dial painters coming in for analysis. And so he sent us some strontium-90 dial painters and said, all right, see what you can do with these. Well, we calibrated the chair to count P32 just as a hard beta emitter that we could easily lay our hands on, that was pure and could easily be calibrated. And we played with it for a while, just looking at the bremsstrahlung from the P32 in the body.
Yep.
And we counted his strontium-90 dial painters, and we nailed it. I mean, we were right on the nose. And we had a bet going with Bob on what we could do, and we nailed it. So we showed what we could do with the thing, and that really paid off handsomely later on. In the mid-'90s, we had that large P32 mysterious ingestion in one of our
at MIT.
At MIT,
Yeah.
and one of our researchers, and we were able to get the best series of data you ever saw on both the excretion and the retention in that worker over a period of time by doing a 24-hour urinalysis for 60 days and by doing daily whole body counts on them.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I wanted to bring it up because it was such a beautiful job of following through on an incident from beginning to the end and knowing exactly what happened all the way through and convincing the NRZ that was so.
We nailed it. We not only determined where the missing material came from, but we were able to recover it all. I mean, that was one of my excuses for doing 60 days worth of 24-hour urinalysis. We recovered all of the activity. What missing activity?
Yeah.
You know, it's right there in those urine jugs. You know.
Let's close off with one more item. You've been involved in medical physics, as you said in the beginning.
Yep.
Can you make a quick statement about anything about that would be of interest?
Yeah. To answer your earlier question, to cap it, we set up bionuclear measurements to market the chair counter,
Yeah.
and that was my first company, and that was quite successful for a number of years until we finally closed
You
it out.
also built me a whole body bird counter.
That's right. I built you a whole body bird
for
counter
using
for that.
birds to study the environment, the
That's
radioactive
exactly right.
environment.
That's the only one we know of that's ever been built.
And it worked.
And it worked. In the mid-'70s, I was still doing medical physics for New England Medical Center and medical health physics for New England Medical Center and Tufts University, which is their sister agency and sister university. And that medical physics, health physics demand was increasing. And so Gail and I decided at that stage in the game to incorporate and to begin to grow that company to see what would happen with it. And that company today has 14 or 15 employees and about 150 retainer clients. So the
Slightly small operation.
it's a nice operation. It's a nice program, and it's and we have our clients are scattered throughout New England, and it's we've never advertised, we've never promoted it or anything else, and the limit in the size of the corporation is me, because it's FX Masse Associates Incorporated, and because it's FX Masse Associates Incorporated, nothing goes out the door without my reviewing it and without my signing off on it. So the limit in the size of the corporation is the limit in what I can review and cover and be sure is the quality that I require. You know? So,
well, I want to now that we're ending, I want to let people know that they're still as smart as you've been, because you've ended up living in my town.
that's right.
Well, it's been a pleasure being your friend and your colleague for, what, 4 decades
4
anyway?
decades, that's
plus,
right, that's right,
So
yeah,
forth.
yeah.
And thank you for this interview.
Okay, my pleasure.
Oh, that worked.